What's the wildest rich people don't get it moment you've witnessed? Before we start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience. Story 1. Back when I was in my early 20s, my beat-up old car broke down in my job's parking lot when I was about to drive home. I was getting paid $10 an hour as a pastry chef at a catering company. This was barely enough to cover my rent. I was obviously pretty distraught over my car dying. My boss, company owner, ended up saying to me, "Why are you so upset? It's just a car. Just buy another one." I couldn't even respond. I just looked at her like she was crazy. Story 2. I occasionally drive minibuses for a private school in the UK. Have overheard some very privileged conversations from the students. But one that sticks out is, a tutor on the bus asked a student what he says when other students make comments about the very expensive watches he wears to school. To which he said his response is, "My dad has the same 24 hours as your dad." He then proceeded to go on about how his dad inherited a massive entertainment chain and various hugely successful companies from his grandfather. Answer. This reminds me of a conversation I had in medical school with a former friend of mine. She had two very wealthy doctor parents who sent her to a very expensive school, paid her tuition, and gave her a generous allowance, which was automatically replaced when spent. I finally got to go to uni in my late 20s, having dropped out of school to start working. No one in my family had been to university before. I worked darn hard to save up for tuition fees, still have a lot of loans, and my parents managed to contribute about 20 of the cost. I had an argument with said friend who said someone would have to be dumb to not make it because, and I quote, "Life is a level playing field." Story 3. It's just so easy to just drop $1,000 at Target, you know? My Starbucks co-worker in Calabasas, Kardashian land, after he spent $983 on toys for his 4-year-old nephew's birthday. I don't know why he worked at Starbucks, except maybe his rich family finally forced him to get a job. Story 4. A co-worker asked me what bank I used for my safe deposit box. I said I didn't have a safe deposit box. She said, "But where do you keep your jewels then?" Edit. I said I didn't have any jewels, and she just said, "Huh," and changed the subject. I actually get the sentiment. If I owned anything expensive, I would probably also have a safe place for it. But something about it made her sound like a Disney villain, even though she was a very nice person. It's a very vivid random memory. Thanks, OP. Story 5. Company event where people with investment properties told us that you just need to save hard to get that deposit. Just don't go out to dinner with your spouse as much, or just go to the pub every other Friday. Yeah, so reducing restaurant dinners from 0 to 0 and the pub tab from 0 to 0. Still broke. My colleague left the Zoom midway through. If it was in person, he would have broken the door on the way out or came across the conference table at them. Story 6. My boss at the time made between 5-10x more than I did. We were talking about big purchases like a car or house, and he says something along the lines of, "Well, you'll get a great deal since you'd all cash purchaser." I just kind of smile and nod, knowing that, on my salary that he was aware of, I was not even an all-cash purchaser of groceries. Story 7. While working for a valet parking service in the Santa Barbara area years ago, a woman hired us for a jewelry showing she was having at her giant house in Montecito. And while we were waiting for guests to arrive, my boss informed me that when the guests get in their cars to leave, that I needed to be sure to close their car doors, or else they would just drive off with their doors open, as they're so used to people closing their car doors for them. Story 8. I needed a bicycle to get to a new job. Found someone online selling a really nice bike for cheap, so got in touch. Took 2 trains to their house to buy the bike, and when I got there, it was a mansion. The bike was in a garage full of supercars and classics. They asked me where my truck was to load the bike on. When I told them I was riding the bike home, they laughed. And before I knew it, everyone in the house had been called to the garage to hear how I was riding the bike 3 hours home in the dark. No one offered me a lift. They just acted blessed at how they didn't have to do such things. Answer, feel this. Even from not as rich people, I have still been asked why I don't take the car instead of public transport when I buy used stuff. Or once, when I picked up a lamp for free, the woman asked me why I didn't just buy it as it wasn't expensive. Like, what did she expect me to answer? Start sharing my whole story of how I just moved to a place on my own and don't have parents who can help buy stuff for me? If someone spends time on picking stuff up or buying used stuff without a car, it's probably not for fun. Story 9. My old boss was verbally criticizing her new son-in-law and said, "He won't be any kind of decent husband. Hell, he only makes X an hour at his lousy job." My boss clearly forgot that I was making less than that. Story 10. I was a live-in super of a BLDG in Boston. The BLDG was 43 units. 40 were college kids. 1 year, a young girl moved in next to me. 3 months later, her electricity was shut off. She started pounding on my door, demanding that I turn her electricity back on. I checked her circuit breakers. They were fine. Went into her app to immediately notice the pile of electric company mail on her table with big red letters, last warning. Me, you didn't tell the electric company that you were the new tenant. Tenant, what's the difference? Why do they need to know it's me? Me, they need to send you a bill for electricity usage. Tenant, now I know you're messing with me. You don't pay for electricity. She moved out 2 days later of embarrassment. Her parents having to pay for breaking the lease. She couldn't look at me for those 2 days. Story 11. I'm a type 1 diabetic and medical costs are insane without insurance. This happened in 2012 when the ACA bill was going through Congress. My boss was against it, and I told him how getting on insurance would help me. He grimaced and said, "That is your responsibility. You should get a job." I worked for him, and he made sure to not provide benefits for the employees. Story 12. Rishi Sunak, British Prime Minister for the moment, is stinking rich and grew up in a pretty affluent family. Went to a leading private school, Winchester and Oxford. Doing the interview rounds in the current election campaign, he was pressed by an interviewer about whether his family had ever had to give anything up. After much umming and ahhing, the only thing he could come up with was Sky TV, a British satellite TV service. He was lampooned for days about that one. He really is a colossal twat. Story 13. I love the Dairy Girls, and I asked my husband to watch it with me again because I found it really funny. After watching the first episode with him, he said, "It is funny, but I can't relate to their problems with money and food." Answer, oof, this reminds me of how I used to watch Malcolm in the Middle reruns after school. My brother, so yes, we had the same upbringing, said, "Why do you watch a show about poor people?" I am still aghast. My brother really turned into a jerk in his high school and college years, but being so classist and smug about it still got to me. Also, I am aware that he could have said that because he knew it would bother me, because siblings. But knowing him, it was not solely a comment made to needle at me. Story 14. Used to travel for a glamping company, Glamour Camping, where we would set up huge canvas tents for fancy weddings and parties. We woke up real early one morning to a bunch of calls from some rich LA socialite about how the tents were wet. No other explanation. We rushed over, and it turns out she had no idea what the concept of condensation in the morning was. I can't control nature. Sorry, lady. You're not getting your deposit back. Story 15. I work for a startup based out of San Francisco. I'm a remote employee halfway across the country and am therefore a sort of second-class citizen. My direct peers who work in SF make at least double what I do. And they almost all had extremely privileged upbringings. They went to top 10 business schools, they summer in Tahoe, that kind of thing. I was in the home office a few months ago for our annual kickoff meeting, and one of the speakers polled the room. Has anyone here worked at Amazon? Nobody raised their hand. Wow, I'm surprised. I said, does warehouse count? And the entire room erupted in laughter. For certainly, I just told a very enjoyable joke. Answer, I don't think I know anyone who is rich, but I have a PhD, and most of my colleagues grew up in a more privileged home than I did. In the first in my family to have a graduate degree, I worked my jerk off at a state school. My dad worked in a factory. My colleagues all assume he was an engineer. He was not. I am one of the few PhDs that I know who has worked a variety of low-wage jobs, including in grad school. It's a bizarre feeling to have so little in common with your coworkers. When you said your colleagues thought you were joking about working in a warehouse, I felt that in my soul. Story 16. The I wanna say 12 or 13-year-old son of one of my clients literally expressed confusion to me when I asked them where I could get more paper towels from when they ran out in the washroom of his parents' however many million-dollar yacht. He said something like, "It's always there. What do you mean?" He was so disconnected from the process of, I guess, cleaning and restocking that he just thought that stuff would always be there and never run out. LOL, the look of genuine confusion on his face was just something else. That's not the first time I experienced that either. Talking to the kids of extremely wealthy people is always a trip. Story 17. When we met in our friend group, the rich friend showed us his new expensive winter jacket for $500, and from time to time he goes on a shopping haul with his rich dad where he spends $101 One time we confronted him about his bragging and asked him if he didn't think that his spending for clothes is quite a lot. His answer, well, I know some people who spend more and I know some people who spend less. So I think I am average statistics 101. Story 18. This girl got genuinely angry and offended when people suggested she could take public transportation to the airport instead of paying for a 50 Uber. She posted on social media about it, edit. The bus they suggested is very convenient and goes directly from our college to the airport, so it's not like she'd have to drag her luggage from bus line to bus line. Story 19. There was a guy who recently gave all his money away and lived on the streets to prove that anyone could earn millions. Then his father died and left him millions. He then stopped living on the streets and claimed to have proved his point. Edit, spelling. Story 20. I wouldn't consider this out of touch, but I was definitely amazed. Several years ago, I worked at a retail store that sold a lot of different items. I was on the cashier one Friday afternoon when 3 young women, early 20s, walked in decked out in luxury brands. They bought a suitcase and several other random items that totaled almost $400. Once I announced the total price, one of them pulled out 4 Benjamins like she was pulling out issues and handed them to me without looking. I asked if they were going on a trip. One of them answered, "No, we got sick of carrying our stuff." I mean, I get tired carrying stuff too. But darn, to buy a whole suitcase and more just because they were tired was crazy to see. Story 21. I've known quite a few people to not realize the benefit they received by just getting a house, car, and cost of a degree, sometimes including advance, from their parents. Much easier to budget when those items are removed from the equation. Even more so when you can get some income from the house. Answer. I saw this documentary about one of America's most prolific 18th century slave traders, and in an interview with his present-day descendants, it was asked if they felt they had benefited from the privilege of their lineage, and most said no, that they lived somewhat average lives. Then they were asked where they went to college, and it was all Princeton, Brown, and Harvard. And it turned out their average lives were full of property and creative jobs. They just failed to grasp how fortunate their lives were. Just found the scene here. Story 22. During a dinner party, we started talking about our experiences in high school. I mentioned the diversity of my large 6A school and that almost half the student population was on free or reduced lunch. A woman who had grown up privileged in the San Francisco area absolutely burst out laughing and thought I was joking. She said, "Free or reduced lunch? Why? What, they couldn't afford food?" It got real quiet and real awkward when I explained, yes, that's exactly what happens in public school. She had only attended private school, kindergarten through grad school. Story 23. I was talking to a very rich lady we had just videotaped. She was a board of director at one of the largest oil companies on the planet. She told me she used to summer in Prague. I told her I used to summer in school. I thought that was a darn funny line, but it didn't even register to her. She was just confused on how that had anything to do with what she said. Story 24. Once had a college-age co-worker explain to a bunch of us in EMS, try to explain that his family wasn't that rich because they only have a beach house, not a summer house, and then explain the difference between the two. Another co-worker then went to pull up his apartment complex and pointed out the trailer park next door. Rich co-worker then remarked that it must be nice to live next to a storage facility, referring to the trailer park. He didn't believe us when we explained that people lived in those trailers. He thought that was only something that happened on reality TV shows. We all hoped that inner city EMS would help bring him back down to earth, but it had no effect. Story 25. I used to teach at a very expensive private school. This school went all the way through from kindergarten to high school. I had to give some students, who were about 9 years old, a ride in my car one time. A spoilt set of twins in particular couldn't understand why my car was so old and poor looking. Adults are apparently supposed to have new expensive cars. My dad is an adult and he drives a Rolls Royce. He gets a new car every year. You should get a new car too. Why don't you buy a new car? When I tried to explain that I was still in my first year of teaching and had only finished uni last year so didn't really have money yet, the response was, "But our dad has always had new cars, even when he was at university." On another occasion, one of them smashed her brand new iPhone on purpose to prove to other students her dad would buy her a new one. Story 26. At a high-end kids clothing resale store called Once Upon a Child, the store only buys Nike, Adidas, or other well-known brand name kids clothes and only kids clothes. Everything must be new or barely worn or they won't buy it. Usually when you bring in a bunch of stuff for them to buy, they'll only buy 10 of what you bring in. I once saw them say no to a beautiful custom-made dress that an Indian couple had spent $300 on for their only child daughter. The reason was that it wasn't a brand name. So, at that store, some mom was selling a bunch of clothes and finding out what the store was taking and for how much. Her 8-year-old had wandered off into the store and came back with something she wanted to buy. Mom: "No, sweetie, we don't shop here. We only come here so poor people have nice things to buy. Story 27. Rich friend, just take Friday off work and fly out to visit me this weekend. I know it's last minute, but I'm sure there's seats available. Me, I don't think I can make this weekend. Rich friend, oh yeah, I looked and saw it was only coach available. Don't be embarrassed. I don't blame you for not wanting to sit next to them. Me thinking, does this guy truly think that's why? Lol, I just earn average money. Answer, we try really hard to not rent a vehicle when we travel. I like the slow pace of public transportation and the lack of stress navigating. Anyway, we had made friends with the guy who owned the tour company we went on a pub crawl with and made plans to meet up after a hockey game. Told him we'd get there when we could because we didn't know how packed the train would be after the game. And he said, just take an Uber. You don't want to ride with those people. We are those people, you twat. Oh, and I'd like to add our train pulled away before the line of cars began to move out of the parking lot. Who won? Story 28. Rich kid, who is a super nice guy, wanted to go drinking with my buddy. My buddy said he didn't have any money. The rich kid said, no problem. We'll stop at a bank machine on the way there. The concept of having no money didn't even register. The rich kid thought that my buddy just didn't have any money in his wallet. Story 29. 350,000 a year is not enough to live. This was my canker sore of an uncle-in-law 3 years ago, complaining that if he's not making close to $1 million a year, he can't live as it won't cover the basics. He also lacked the self-awareness to realize he's the only person on his payroll making over $100,000 a year. If he can't make it on $350K a year, then what does he think his employees do? Story 30. A really rich kid I worked with, well, he was like maybe 25 or 26, was out to dinner with us on a work event. He ordered a bottle of wine from the sommelier, and the sommelier indicated he no longer had that vintage, but he had a similar vintage. He also explained politely the cost delta. The first bottle was going to be $750 and the new bottle would be $825. Rich kid looks around the table and asks, is that a lot? Our boss just said, not if you're buying. But if I'm buying you, better pick something else. I've told this story before on Reddit, but it's still one of my favorite examples. Story 31. Owner of the company I used to work for was a car guy. His daily driver was a giant, fully kitted out Chevy Tahoe that he rarely drove more than just himself in. And he also owned a Ferrari, 1 or 2 Mercedes, and a Jaguar, I think. Specific models I don't know. I just know they were pricey. One day after I had worked there for a couple years, he came to our office in NorCal and tossed me the fob to his Tahoe and said, I need you to drive this down to Paso Robles, our office on the Central Coast, about a 5-hour drive where he is based out of. When I asked how I would get home, he said he would make sure I get taken care of. When I asked how he would get back home, he said, my Ferrari that I'm picking up from the shop. Later in the day, I asked him to show me where his windshield wiper controls were since rain was expected during my drive. He said it's all automatic, and when I asked how that works, he goes, how old is your car? Very nice guy that gave out generous bonuses every year, but he was pretty out of touch with us normies. Story 32. My friend has a charity and these wealthy folks took him out to dinner to talk about the work he does. When it came down to making a donation of any amount, they were hesitant on whether to give. The bill for dinner came to the table and it was like $1,500 and they just dropped their Amex card like it was no big deal. Story 33. Gwyneth Paltrow talking about how her lifestyle brand Goop caters to the common woman with items including the $495 or hoodie, $625 Sarah cardigan, $720 Sandra V-neck top, and $66 egg-shaped female body part Jade Rock. Story 34. My coworker argued with me when I told him $20,000 would be life-changing for me and my family because it wouldn't be life-changing for his. I think he thinks everybody has a rich dad that gives them money. I work at this job literally to survive, and he works there because his dad told him he needed to get a job to keep getting his allowance. Story 35. Me. How can you justify paying us an exact median wage when the cost of living in Denver is far from median? VP of Comcast. I was on food stamps once and now look at me. You just have to work hard. Me. I was told that about college too. $70K in debt making slightly above mine wage. VP. I think you just have a bad attitude. The old pull yourself up by the bootstraps argument. Story 36. Doctor told me to work with my personal trainer to figure out a routine that wouldn't make my chronic autoimmune disorder worse. I asked if he was going to cover the cost of a personal trainer out of his own pocket. BC Insurance sure as shoot won't cover it, and I've never been able to hold a job in my entire adult life because of said chronic autoimmune disorder. Dude was shocked poor people exist, and one was in his office. Story 37. I was telling a cute girl I met at a friend's birthday about a boom I was reading, The Zanzibar Chest. It was about a British journalist whose father was some minor colonial official. The journalist traveled extensively as part of his dad's work and his own. I mentioned wanting to travel to less popular destinations. Always wanted to go to Mongolia. My grandfather got lost in the desert there once, and it was a wild story. Her response was that I should just enjoy my life and go. I know lots of people who travel a lot, so the advice was not that outlandish, but I mentioned family I was taking care of, things I needed to save for and not having flexibility at work. It became a point of contention like, no, you just have to say fudge it and go. Your family will understand. My grandfather had late-stage Alzheimer's and we were taking care of him at home. He didn't know my name, much less understand things. Story 38. Me and my ex were struggling financially when we first got married. I made enough to pay the bills, but there was nothing extra. She decided to enroll in school, and when she was filling out the FAFSA for financial aid, she asked me what my adjusted gross income was for the previous year. I have always done my own taxes, but at the time always threw the paperwork away when I was done, so I had no idea what it was. Our friend who was at our house at the time came from a very wealthy family who owned a hotel chain, had government contracts, etc. Without a second thought, he said, just call your accountant, they'll have it. He was baffled by the fact that having a personal accountant isn't something everyone has. Blew his mind. Story 39. Had a person in my office who we all joke about is like a distilled pure boomer. He got talking about Hurricane Katrina for some reason, talking about how stupid everyone was for not evacuating. I told him many of the people in NLA didn't have the means to get out even if they wanted to. He said, I know times get tough, but sometimes you just have to crack open that savings account. I was dumbfounded. To be so out of touch that you think the people stuck down in the 9th Ward had a stash of money they were just sitting on? Story 40. This from the UK's current PM, so we'd realize that, as someone worth more than our king, he can resonate with those he represents struggling in poverty. He was asked if he had ever gone without something by an interviewer. All sorts of things like lots of people. There'll be all sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have. Famously, Sky TV, so that was something that we never had growing up, actually. Story 41. My sister's ex was born into a rich family and was so out of touch it was unreal. He was the poster child for spoiled white bro. He was racist, homophobic, misogynistic, and downright rude. His parents found him a fancy job making very good money, so he immediately threw it in my face that I'm lazy and stupid for not finding better jobs. I have a disability and it's incredibly difficult to find work. He told me, if you don't like the job market in this country, leave. Easy for a rich, spoiled brat to say when mommy and daddy's money can pay for your cruises around the world while I'm struggling just to find my next meal. I'm glad my sister dumped his dumbass. Story 42. I had a friend in high school genuinely confused as to why I needed a new job after quitting my last one. He told me jobs in high school are just for fun because our parents pay for everything. I had to explain to him that my parents didn't pay for my car, insurance, gas, etc. Story 43. I did some medical volunteer work in Haiti post-earthquake, stayed on a Christian missionary compound because the clinic I worked at was supported by the mission. At dinner, I was talking about the bathroom at the clinic, basically an outhouse, and how instead of toilet paper, there was a bucket with torn-up book pages. The only reaction I got was a gasp, followed by, I cannot believe they treat books that way. I was speechless. Like if that's what you took away from that, I cannot help you. Story 44. I've never experienced it personally, but I've heard several stories about rich people who flat out refuse to respond to anything said or asked by cashiers, repair people, drivers, etc., on the grounds that they don't talk to the help. Answer, I've had this happen. I set up musical instruments and sound systems for a living. One time I was up in a mansion in a gated community at the top of Beverly Hills, delivering a piano for someone's birthday party. They had the full life-size Throne of Swords from Game of Thrones in their living room. It very well might have been the actual throne from the show. I tried asking a question to the woman who let us in, who was silently watching us work, and she literally just stared at me and then turned around and walked away. Story 45. I taught high school math at a private school for wealthy kids. The lesson was about compound interest and how it's calculated. A student raised their hand and asked, why should we know this? Naive me answered that you need to know when you get a loan to buy a car or mortgage for a house. They looked baffled and asked me why I wouldn't pay for it in cash like the last Mercedes-Benz I bought. I couldn't reply after that. Story 46. My family only has a small yacht. As the follow-up to only sexist because poor, honorable mentions. I should know which years Indiana Jones came out because my dad produced them. My dad bought me an apartment in one of most expensive cities in the world that sits empty so I have a place to stay when I visit. I'm choosing which uni to go to based on which has the nicest piano for me to play. What did I do over break? I stayed in a villa on the French Riviera for 2 months. My millionaire boyfriend is paying my tuition. Story 47. The owner of my company in Texas couldn't believe that everyone in our department had not been on an Alaskan vacation before. This same owner had me draw up floor plans for his new house, and it had an entire room dedicated to Christmas decorations that stayed up year-round because his wife liked Christmas so much. Said Christmas room also had a Christmas closet. Story 48. Worked at a warehouse picking job. They didn't like that we conversed with each other while we passed and such. Owner had us gather and said we should be grateful we weren't working in the sewer somewhere, as if that was all we could aspire to do outside working there. Story 49. Guy I went to college with, he's actually a really good friend, but he has zero idea how the real world works. His bought him this decked out 1,000 mansion of a house and sold it to him on a personal loan without interest for $300,000. I called him on that when he said his family wasn't really that rich. It was just good timing. I really do like the guy, honestly, but holy hell, I wanted to strangle him in that moment. Story 50. My friend who grew up not having to worry about money once said, "Oh, I don't really eat leftovers." I told him that was one of the most entitled things I ever heard. Lol, I wouldn't even say he's rich, but it's definitely a different world not having to consider money all the time. Story 51. Everyone in my life who has told friends to just buy a house because paying rent is stupid when it could be a mortgage instead. I get their angle, but the people they'd say this to haven't been able to save up enough for a down payment, and exclaiming as such was met with something along the lines of, "Why not?" or confusion at the idea of having to save for something like that in the first place. Someone once asked me why I have a mortgage and didn't just pay cash outright instead, because mortgages have interest. So if you just pay with cash, you won't have any interest. So I said, our loan was $170K, but if we take the full 30 years to pay it off, we'll have paid nearly as much on it as our home is worth after interest. Would you be willing to pay off our loan so we can pay you instead of the bank? First he said no, followed by why. Not why, followed by no. That says it all. Story 52. Last year at an elite university, by now I had already gotten used to outlandish things, studying with the children of royalty, politician, CEOs of household brands. It's really an entirely different track they're on compared to the rest of us. Me, on the other hand, my dad is a dosser, and I went through uni with what can only be described as poverty. One day studying in the library with the kid of wealthy landowners, she makes the casual claim of how proud she is of us by funding ourselves through uni. A little confused by this, I ask, what does she mean as I work full-time? And she lives off her trust fund. She clarified she made such a claim because she was choosing to spend her trust fund on her law degree, which is the same as me choosing to work full-time to pay for my law degree, whereas everyone else was being made to go by their parents. Story 53. When I nannied for a tech family, my boss was late on paying me and offered to pay me in Bitcoin instead. Like, if you think you're short on cash, what makes you think I want your fake internet dollars that cannot pay my rent? Story 54. My cousin married a rich guy when she was 21, and she also grew up pretty well off. I was 22 and just got married, and she asked us why we would rent a crappy apartment when a house is so much better. Had to explain that not everyone can afford a home in their early 20s, and especially not a $3 million home like her and her husband owned outright. Then she rolled her eyes and said, well, if you're both working, then you should be able to buy a home. We did end up buying a home the next year, but it was a small starter home that we bought for $150K. And then she said she didn't get why we didn't build a new home that wasn't used. Story 55. In law school, we had obviously a class about constitutional law. One topic was voter registration and IDs, and how there were some racially motivated reasons for things like Jim Crow laws and so on. One of the cases discussed the use of family Bibles as a means of ID in situations where people didn't have a hospital-issued birth certificate. One girl made a point to raise her hand and say that was so stupid. Why wouldn't you get a birth certificate at the hospital? And when the teacher tried to explain that this also applied to destitute folks in BFE in the 50s, she just didn't get it. She also got real pissy over how theft of food for a starving family is still a crime and should still be punished. Oh, and she lost her ever-loving mind when a Jewish classmate referred to Ash Wednesday as having some schmutz on your forehead on her personal Facebook. Like she tried to get the girl kicked out of student government. I've never met someone so entitled, so out of touch, and yet so fudge enraged. It was weird. I don't miss law school even a little. Story 56. Heard about this. A man was watching TV with his GF, a show about third world kids. They were refilling their water bottles from a rather nasty-looking river. This girl said, "Why do they do that instead of going home and filling with tap water?" Story 57. I once visited a VIP tent at the Oktoberfest in Munich. They were handing out umbrellas and then splashed 12-liter champagne bottles over the crowd, which protected themselves from the champagne with their umbrellas. Story 58. Self-made man who inherited his father's successful business. The government shouldn't be funding social services, taxes should be lowered, and then people will have the money to donate to support them. Story 59. My sister-in-law was dating a guy who grew up in India, but was studying in the U.S. His dad was a top surgeon, and he grew up in a house where each family member had their own private apartments. We went away on vacation to the beach a few years ago, and were cleaning up after my mother-in-law cooked dinner. I handed him the broom to sweep, and he proceeded to basically whack the floor with it. I asked him, "Is this the first time you swept before?" He smiled at me a bit sheepishly and said, "Yeah, but I saw the maids do it. It's like this, right?" Later, we let him cut his birthday cake, and he just stared at it before admitting the staff would always do that part. He then butchered the cake. I'll also never get over the time he told me I needed to travel more, and I shouldn't let anything hold me back. I just stared at him before I asked how much he thought a special education teacher made. Unbelievable. Story 60. Back in college, I met this kid. He told a story that his dad took him to buy a car for his birthday. He knew what he wanted but couldn't decide between two colors. His dad bought him both. He was pissed that his dad told him he had to keep them clean. Story 61. Had a similar experience working minimum wage job that had a dress policy. My boss told me my charity shop suit was looking a bit old, and I should go to Armani and buy a new one. I waited expectantly for him to offer me the money, but obviously that never came. Then it dawned on me that he expected me to buy a 1,000 suit while only earning $7 per hour. At that moment, I realized he was an idiot and promptly started looking for a new job. Story 62. I'm sorry that happened to you. I drove to work, was in the left turn lane behind my boss. Don't remember what car trouble I had, but she offered to loan me the money to fix it. She obviously wasn't cluelessly rich, but very comfortable. Story 63. This reminds me of a conversation I had in medical school with a former friend of mine. She had two very wealthy doctor parents who sent her to a very expensive school, paid her tuition, and gave her a generous allowance, which was automatically replaced when spent. I finally got to go to uni in my late 20s, having dropped out of school to start working. No one in my family had been to university before. I worked darn hard to save up for tuition fees, still have a lot of loans, and my parents managed to contribute about 20 of the cost. I had an argument with said friend who said someone would have to be dumb to not make it because, and I quote, "Life is a level playing field." Story 64. I'm not sure whether to take this as, there's nothing that special about the watch. At its core, it performs the same function as any cheap watch, and that's all that really matters. Or, my dad achieved a lot more in the same amount of time as your dad. Narrator, he hadn't. Story 65. I hear this kind of thing so often on Reddit, it's mind-blowing. Just hire a nanny, just hire a doula. Oh, and make sure to hire a backup, just in case, just hire a night nanny a couple nights a week. Like, yeah, you're right. This parenting thing would be way easier if I could just hire a series of people to do it for me. Granted, at least one of them elaborated they weren't from the US, and anyone in their country rich enough to own a computer had hired help, but that's mind-blowing in its own way. Story 66. I knew someone who grew up on an island full of rich twats. He refuses to visit it, even though his wife really wanted to, who were all working part-time at coffee shops or the moral equivalent because it was the bare minimum to satisfy the terms of their trust funds. Story 67. I don't know why he worked at Starbucks, except maybe his rich family finally forced him to get a job. I worked with one of these guys once. He lived in a luxury apartment that his parents owned in the most expensive part of London, and they made him get a job to stay there. Not pay rent or anything. They also paid for anything he wanted. He just had to have a job. He was an absolute fudge twat. Story 68. I saw a brilliant reply to a tweet once that I've used every time this situation arises. Some girl tweeted about how much she saved by cutting out coffee, and this guy replied, "I've studied the habits of millionaires, and while cutting back on small expenses is a good start to building wealth, consider supplementing your income with massive financial fraud." Credit to the author. Roy Scott, you deserve to go viral. Story 69. I get told to save 30 of my income. And no matter how many times I tell them I don't have 30 of my salary available to save because I literally live paycheck to paycheck just on necessities, they just don't compute. Or they start recommending to just move somewhere cheaper. Cheaper, X, got 50 more dangerous in my country, WTF, or manage monthly expenses, as if I don't already. Story 70. That's kind of like saying the losers at the casino just didn't pick the right slot machine to sit at. Unless you're a top 1 savant at trading, passive investing with less than 6 figures is not a viable career path. Story 71. I work in mental health, and the director of the mental health department suggested we all spend time in our gardens or work out in your home gym. She lives in a 2.8 minimum house, while her staff mostly live in 1 BDRM apartments. Story 72. My boss was the same. Find a dedicated space that is only for work. Get dressed up to work from home. Keep your regular hours. Sorry, dude. Daycare is closed, so I'm trying to take care of a baby and a toddler during regular office hours. I'm going to wear a shirt covered in spit up all day. Answer. The dedicated space that is only for work actually did help me stay saner, though. I had a tiny apartment during the pandemic, and working on my couch or in my bedroom was starting to weigh on me. The only unused space was this little corner of my kitchen, but I made it cute. I bought this desk that attaches to the wall and folds up into a cabinet out of the way when you aren't using it, put a curtain up to give visual separation from the small kitchen table that was a foot away, and added a wall sconce. For a couple $100 that I was fortunate enough to be able to spare, I suddenly had somewhere that was more conducive to working. Story 73. I work in healthcare, and I've seen the suggestion for our mental health and well-being is to get up and stretch sometimes, as if most of the work in AOA hospital isn't people running around and being on their feet. Also, my job has, probably due to law requirements, 1 10-minute breaks per 6 hours and 1 30-minute lunch per shift. I work a 10-hour shift, and some of my colleagues work 12-hour shifts. I sometimes feel guilty when I go to the bathroom for too long or grab and chug a coffee in the morning before my first official break. The work wellness shoot is so annoying and so patronizing. Story 74. This one really pissed me off. They would always make us go on camera. At the time, I was living in my condo and was using the kitchen as my office. Forgive me if I don't want to go on camera in the kitchen. The execs were in Cabo or whatever, at their vacation home and getting golf lessons. Tone deaf. Story 75. The mental health and well-being part reminded me of an interview I heard on NPR during the pandemic. Some guy was talking about the mental health crisis worsened by the pandemic. The interviewer asked him if he thought that income was a roadblock to getting help, and his answer was basically, absolutely not. Anyone can call these crisis hotlines. They're absolutely free. And TBH, I was livid. That guy was so out of touch. Like a cool, if I'm tragic and I can call that number. And then what? Maybe I'm talked down for one night. But what if they send the cops to my house? Who's going to pay for the hospital stay? Meds, therapy? Of course, income is a roadblock to mental health care, you buffoon. Story 76. Wordman. I used to work for a company that was mainly remote, and the boss said that we were required to have a private office area that's preferably its own room. And if we really couldn't swing a private in-home office, our work area definitely couldn't in a bedroom or something, because it's important to have a separate room space that's only dedicated to work, and it would be so inappropriate to be able to see a bed or something in the background of Zoom videos. I was so confused, like they know how much we're paid though, right? And they know how much rent is? Story 77. Mine is a story my dad likes to tell about the first parent meeting at my college orientation. The school spent 20 minutes talking about tuition payment plans. Then the mom of a kid had met earlier in the day raised her hand and asked in genuine confusion, as if everyone else in the room was stupid, why would anyone bother with all that when you could just write one check for the entire year? Story 78. I've told this before, but my boss was trying to stop me from taking 1 or 2 days off at a time because their accountant was complaining about the extra work or whatever. I explained I was using the days to take a Saturday and Sunday off, here and there, to visit my family for birthdays or whatever. She responded, wouldn't you rather take a whole week off so you can fly somewhere warm? I just stared at her and said, I make minimum wage. How am I supposed to pay for that? She had no answer. Story 79. I was talking to the owner of the building my old work clinic was in. He was taking his wife back to Germany on vacation for the 3rd or 4th time that year. I mentioned how jealous I was. He told me that the only way I was going to go was to just do it. He said that too many people wait for the right timing and don't just take themselves traveling. I was making $55K a year at the time, the single earner for a family of 3 with a toddler. Rent was about 40 of my income. Story 80. My mom never let us believe in Santa. She always said it was a game people play. Once when I was a little older, I asked why, and she said that before I was born, she taught kindergarten at a school with massive income inequality in Texas. Every single January, all the rich kids would come back from Christmas break bragging about all their presents, and all poor kids would come back crying because they couldn't figure out what they'd done that was horrible enough to put them on Santa's bad list because he'd skipped their house again, just like he did every other year. That changed my entire perspective. Santa is supposed to give presents to good kids and skip bad kids' houses. But if you believe that, then by default, all rich kids are automatically good and all poor kids are automatically bad. Story 81. I feel like this can be an older generation thing, regardless of socioeconomic status. Many older women I know who are not wealthy or even financially secure have precious or expensive jewelry that was passed down to them and nowhere else to keep it where they feel it's truly safe, so why not the bank? They'll often keep certain very important papers in the safety deposit box as well. Story 82. I read a memoir a few years ago that I found incredibly frustrating because the author tried to paint herself as the child of some struggle. The story was framed as talking about the vehicles they owned, and one chapter opened up with her and her father in his new, to him, Porsche going to buy her a Volvo because the vehicle she already owned needed a brake job. Story 83. A minimum down payment on a detached house is $300,000 here. To get that together in 5 years would take $60,000 per year or $5,000 per month savings. I can assure you, the royal you, that I'm not spending $5,000 per month on dinners out and the pub Lowell. Story 84. I just realized, and I don't know why I never put this together, that when they talk about going out to dinner, they don't mean the 30, 50 working class people spend. These types of people drop hundreds when they go out to eat. They think you're spending as much as they do to eat dinner. Of course, cutting back on 300 dinner dates would save a shootload of money, but normal people aren't spending that much going out, so their advice falls flat regardless. Story 85. My first office job paid $25 a year. Like 10 years ago, not in the 50s or something. They had a silent auction for charity where everything started at like $500. I looked at it and was like, if they want us to donate that much, maybe they should pay us enough to be able to afford it. Story 86. I had a boss complain in a department meeting about how hard it was to find a rental car for his family Hawaii vacation he was taking during the pandemic. Meanwhile, the rest of us weren't getting paid enough to make rent without a roommate. Story 87. I was talking about taxes and about rich people with my then boss. I said that six-figure incomes need not apply for tax credits. She's a dentist. I was an assistant. Her base salary was literally 5 times my salary. She was shocked that I thought she was rich. Did I mention her husband also made 6 figures? I had to slowly explain to her that she made my annual salary in just 3 months. It was quite the conversation. We were state employees. She was nothing control of my pay. Story 88. My boss over the course of a few weeks repeatedly told me I should buy fresh food from the deli and make homemade food, since it's so much better for you, in response to seeing me eat frozen meals each day. I honestly wanted to hit him. The guy had a stay-at-home wife who did all the shopping and cooking for him. Most of the time, he didn't even know what his lunch was until he opened it. So this was more about time than money, but still, some people are so out of touch. Story 89. Surinyur. A manager once walked up on me at a job site and made a point of asking loudly, "Hey Toki, how you living life?" I was talking to a group of people at the time when he interrupted me. I just turned to him and said, "Paycheck to paycheck. How about you?" For context, I was still using broken tools and being told we couldn't afford better stuff. And Shoot for Brains here is gifted a brand new truck from the company. Story 90. Something like this has happened a couple of times where I took the opportunity to say, "Oh, you don't pay me enough that I could do that." Both times I got a raise within a couple weeks, but definitely still not enough for me to be able to do that. Story 91. Feel this. Even from not as rich people, I have still been asked why I don't take the car instead of public transport when I buy used stuff. Or once when I picked up a lamp for free, the woman asked me why I didn't just buy it as it was expensive. Like, what did she expect me to answer? Start sharing my whole story of how I just moved to a place on my own and don't have parents who can help buy stuff for me. If someone spends time on picking stuff up or buying used stuff without a car, it's probably not for fun. Story 92. Not quite the same, but a few years back, one of my kids was having mental health issues and I was playing hell getting them to the treatments they needed because I didn't have a car. They were being transferred from a short-term facility to a longer-term place that was 2 miles, with no sidewalks, from the nearest bus stop, and expected me to be able to just drop everything and do this with no advance notice, even after I'd told them multiple times that I didn't have a vehicle. I was venting about this on Facebook, and one of my, now former, FB friends said something along the lines of, well, get your husband to come home from work early so you can use his car. Like, no. When I say there's no car, I mean exactly that. Not we only have one car. Story 93. Why can they afford a phone? They're homeless. Ah, yes, the cost of a phone is the same as monthly rent on an apartment and also has the same requirements of a W-2, a moderate to high FICO score, and good rental references. Got it. Story 94. My dad asked me why homeless people don't just clean up in a bathroom and how disgusting it is that they don't. I had to explain many people won't even let homeless people in to use the bathroom. We are not close to rich. I do not understand. Story 95. I hope his male body part rots off. Sorry, every F-King Republican I know says stuff like this. The CU next Tuesday I grew up with as a best friend knew my parents died because they couldn't get health care, and she told me it was immoral, our tax money go to help the poor. She's never had to work in her life, never will, and has had health and dental her whole life provided for her. Story 96. 2008 to 2012 was a tremendous squeeze on the bottom income half of the country, and we have been experiencing the political ramifications of that since. The top half of the country got on a new footing by 2010. Story 97. It's crazy how he already came from a privileged background, but his wife's family wealth catapulted him from, yeah, they're pretty rich, to they could probably buy their own planet. His father-in-law is one of the richest men in the world, I believe. Story 98. This twat has got an even more affluent father-in-law who wants his employees to work 80-90 hours a week at minimum wage. The FIL's company has not raised wages for any new graduates entering the company from the last 10-12 years. Annual salary for new graduates employed at Wipro, INR 300,000, USD 3,600. Story 99. Oh man, that reminds me. I work for a pretty decently sized tech company that does the in-house catered lunch thing every day. They generally always have leftovers, especially after the pandemic, because it's always a hit or miss when people want to work in office versus remote. A lot of people generally swarm at the end to grab whatever's left to take home, and one of the engineers said something akin to, I don't understand why people freak out about throwing this stuff away. It's just food. Story 100. Ooh, this reminds me of how I used to watch Malcolm in the Middle reruns after school. My brother, so yes, we had the same upbringing, said, why do you watch a show about poor people? I am still aghast. My brother really turned into a jerk in his high school and college years, but being so classist and smug about it still got to me. Also, I am aware that he could have said that because he knew it would bother me, because siblings. But knowing him, it was not solely a comment made to needle at me. Story 101. Reminds me of a teacher I had in high school. She was a Princeton grad but got in with a full scholarship, never could have afforded it otherwise. She joked that until she went there, she'd never heard someone use the word summer as a verb before. Story 102. I don't think I know anyone who is rich, but I have a PhD, and most of my colleagues grew up in a more privileged home than I did. I'm the first in my family to have a graduate degree. I worked my jerk off at a state school. My dad worked in a factory. My colleagues all assume he was an engineer. He was not. I am one of the few PhDs that I know who has worked a variety of low-wage jobs, including in grad school. It's a bizarre feeling to have so little in common with your coworkers. When you said your colleagues thought you were joking about working in a warehouse, I felt that in my soul. Story 103. That doesn't even take that much money. I know people who barely qualify as upper middle class who have kids so sheltered from the concept of work that they, as teenagers, were amazed at a restaurant where you could see the kitchen. They had never stopped to think how the food were cooked. Story 104. I'm kind of like that, but on the opposite side. I grew up in cabins and regularly hauled drinking water. Half the people I know live similarly. Half grew up middle class or above in suburbia. So I figured maybe half the people live like I did. My boyfriend's like, no, babe. Most people have an actual room and shower in their house growing up. You were just poor, and rural of... Story 105. There was a similar rich dude that wanted to prove becoming a millionaire is easy. Anyone can do it. So he pretended to have zero with the goal of making $1 million in a year. He ended up quitting, retiring back to his mansion after 10 months due to health reasons. He also only made about $60,000 in those 10 months. Story 106. I am a fairly low-income single parent, but I help my daughter out with car insurance, etc., because she needs a car to work so that she can pay rent while she studies for her degree. She wouldn't be able to do what she needs to without a little help here and there. Different scale than buying new cars, city apartments, business loans. The wealthy give their self-made kids, but works the same. Story 107. I saw this documentary about one of America's most prolific 18th century slave traders, and in an interview with his present-day descendants, it was asked if they felt they had benefited from the privilege of their lineage, and most said no, that they lived somewhat average lives. Then they were asked where they went to college, and it was all Princeton, Brown, and Harvard. And it turned out their average lives were full of property and creative jobs. They just failed to grasp how fortunate their lives were. Just found the scene here. Story 108. One of the best articles I've ever read about the difference between multimillionaire and billionaires was a profile on the top private jet salesman in the entire world. A guy who was obsessed with private jets out of sheer love for aviation and engineering, who'd done well enough to amass a net worth of $80 million. The kicker in this fantastically written article was about how, despite the fact that this salesman now had a fortune that would be totally inconceivable to 99.99% of people, he was still nowhere near having the amount of money where it would make financial sense for him to justify owning his own private plane. This is the problem with extreme wealth inequality at the highest levels. When you're worth $100 million, your entire community, basically every single person you interact with outside of service staff, is either as rich as you are or richer. If you're worth $100 million and you only hang out with billionaires, you quickly start to genuinely believe that you're poor. Story 109. Similar story here. An ex of mine was a mechanic and had been looking for another job. She got a couple of offers, one from a BMW dealership and the other from a VW dealership. I mentioned this to a coworker from a wealthy family, and she was like, "You'd look better in a BMW. She should take that job." Where'd anyone mention being able to afford to own one of the type of cars she worked on? LOL. Those are two completely different things. Story 110. Emma Nanny and the kids at their school aren't crazy rich but well off. One time I had to pick a friend of the oldest NK in my car. She kept asking why we needed the windows down. Act doesn't work. Why we couldn't listen to her favorite songs, only radio and so on. It's a 2011 Hyundai Sonata, and it gets me to where I need to go, and I keep it clean, but I have never felt so embarrassed, especially from a child. Never again on my car. Story 111. I always thought flying was for more well-off people growing up. Hundreds of dollars just to get to the destination. That seemed like such a huge expense. We weren't living in poverty, but we weren't taking flights anywhere. Story 112. We try really hard to not rent a vehicle when we travel. I like the slow pace of public transportation and the lack of stress navigating. Anyway, we had made friends with the guy who owned the tour company we went on a pub crawl with and made plans to meet up after a hockey game. Told him we'd get there when we could because we didn't know how packed the train would be after the game. And he said, "Just take an Uber. You don't want to ride with those people. We are those people, you twat." Oh, and it'd like to add our train pulled away before the line of cars began to move out of the parking lot. Who won? Story 113. People in general, even in the middle classes, just don't understand that it's not the small expenses that are the difference between being poor or not. It's the fact that you can't ever bank enough money for a down payment or repay a loan. Story 114. I work in one of the best restaurants in the world. Bills are always like this. Guests usually don't even look at the bill. They just pay, leave an absolute massive tips, and go home. I'm just amazed every time how nonchalant they are about the whole thing. Story 115. I'm on Social Security due to chronic illness. ATM. Went to the orthopedist because of pain. It was winter. She said cycling would help my hip pain, and to just get an e-bike, they're fun to use. And so easy, I might even lose a few pounds. When I told her there is no way with my financial situation, she looked dejected for a few seconds before suggesting to wish for one for Christmas from my family. I still don't own an e-bike. Story 116. A lot of doctors come from wealthy families. Many of them never had a job prior to becoming a doctor, meaning they went to high school, went to college, went to medical school without ever working, and their first job was residency. Meaning for some of them, surgeon was their first job. Story 117. My boss has this viewpoint. He's a doctor. He's obviously well set. He tells me constantly that I'm richer than any old billionaire because I still have so much life left to live. Okay, dude, but life is goddamn expensive and living paycheck to paycheck is jerk. Story 118. As a kid, I used to go to this charity dentistry to get free checkups and cleanings. Every time I went, I was asked when I was planning on getting braces. Never. BC, I'm poor. I'm just gonna have crooked teeth forever. It made me angry as a kid BC. It just felt like I was being mocked. Story 119. Also thinking 20 an hour fast food minimum wage increase in California is outrageous, and they shouldn't have wages that support a family when they just flip burgers. Sir, that is a very low income wage. That wage can't even support a single person in California. Lol, they can get groceries, gas, and have 3 roommates. Big money, right? And let's not even mention the cost of paying student loans so they can work harder and get a better job. SMH, LOL. Story 120. Had someone say this to me when I worked at a country club as a waiter, so I just left without taking their order. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. When I went back and they were upset, I told them, I was just trying to respect your wishes. Story 121. I've had this happen. I set up musical instruments and sound systems for a living. One time I was up in a mansion in a gated community at the top of Beverly Hills, delivering a piano for someone's birthday party. They had the full life-size Throne of Swords from Game of Thrones in their living room. It very well might have been the actual throne from the show. I tried asking a question to the woman who let us in, who was silently watching us work, and she literally just stared at me and then turned around and walked away. Story 122. The governor of Iowa turned down $26 million from the federal government this year that would have given low-income kids who normally get free or reduced lunch money for food over the summer. Her reasoning was that some kids are obese and don't need food. She said the state would provide a different program. It took months and the total funds are like $700,000. Burn in hell, Kim Reynolds. Story 123. My sister is a therapist and she used to make incredible money at this bougie therapy practice that only accepted customers who weren't using insurance in a very wealthy neighborhood in our city. Her specialty was troubled teens. Almost universally, her clients were children of parents who dropped them off and be like, fix them. And when she'd review with the parents what needed to change at home, they'd be like, I don't understand. I'm paying you to fix this. It legitimately does not compute when they encounter a problem that money won't fix. Answer, bro, I know this platform is hella eat the rich, but this was me growing up. I was sent away across several states to stay away facilities and such, to be drugged, assaulted, abused, etc., because I was a thing that needed to be fixed and my parents had the means to ship me off. That shoot was so jerk. I am now an adult and most of my peers see a perfect background looking in, but I deal with PTSD and feel like I haven't earned it because of the socioeconomic status I was brought up in. I don't complain, but I'm very secretive and have very few, if any, close relationships, especially because so many people immediately dislike anyone who comes from money and write off any problems they have. Kinda rough, but I try to stay aware of my privileges. I know my life isn't nearly as difficult as it could be, but my struggles are still struggles.